Hello and welcome to this video series on personality. This particular video will be centered on the personality trait conscientiousness, which is the trait associated with work and organization. But we're going to delve into what exactly this means, and as usual, if you've seen any of the other videos in this series, we're going to break down conscientiousness into its two subtraits and then describe what they mean as well. So broadly speaking, some of the main signs associated with conscientiousness are being careful, reliable, organized, self-disciplined, persevering, and then those with low conscientiousness are typically carefree, laid back, happy-go-lucky, messy, and inattentive. Another way of looking at conscientiousness as a whole, though, is relating to impulse control, as those who are able to resist certain temptations and stay committed to their goals tend to be those with higher conscientiousness. Now, although this kind of makes it seem like conscientiousness or high conscientiousness is better, again, if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know that it's not quite as simple as this, and no matter where you fall on the spectrum of any personality trait, there are pros and cons. And this is the same too with conscientiousness. So while it might sound like it's a good thing to have impulse control, this is presuming that those impulses are always bad. And of course, sometimes this is the case, but there are circumstances where your impulses can take you to new places and come up with unexpected realizations. So this is why some people with low conscientiousness who come across more carefree are sometimes more likely to push the boundaries or explore things or not get caught up in a particular task and then staying true to that task even though it might not actually be self-serving. Before I break down conscientiousness into its two subtraits, there's one more area I want to touch upon, and that is how it relates to addiction. And obviously we've covered impulse control, so that's sort of related, but actually when you think back, and if you've seen my previous video on extroversion, you'll see how that also somewhat relates to addiction, and we're going to see how the two overlap or intersect when it comes to this particular phenomenon. So high extroversion really comes down to how much positive emotion you experience, and therefore it makes it more likely that you're going to go out and seek pleasurable activities. But what high conscientiousness does is it mitigates the probability of those pleasurable activities getting out of hand because it's relating to impulse control. In some ways then, it's high extroversion that makes it more likely that you're going to start something that could be addictive, but it's low conscientiousness that makes it more likely that you'll continue to do it. Later in the video, we're going to see some of the pros and cons of high and low conscientiousness, but for now, we're going to break down conscientiousness into its two subtraits, the first of which is industriousness and the second is orderliness. So someone with high industriousness tends to carry out their plans. They don't waste time, they don't find it difficult to get down to work, they often finish what they start, they get things done quickly and don't postpone, they always know what they're doing and they're not easily distracted. Whereas someone with high orderliness tends to be tidy, they like order, they're bothered by messy people, they want everything to be just right, they're bothered by disorder, they like routine, they see that rules are observed, and they want every detail to be taken care of. So looking at this list, it's a bit like agreeableness in that it's not quite so obvious what low conscientiousness actually offers. It sounds like all of the traits associated with high conscientiousness and high trait industriousness and orderliness, they all sound like they're good things. But we'll see later how some of these things can get out of hand, but also what are the benefits to having low conscientiousness. But first, there's another thing I want to mention, and that is conscientiousness is actually the second best predictor of life outcome, or in other words, the various successes that you can expect in your life. And the number one is actually IQ. So when you have these two things together, high IQ and high conscientiousness, it kind of sets you up for a certain type of success in life. And really, this should kind of make sense because if you look at the individual traits of conscientiousness, industriousness, and orderliness, they're kind of related to your ability to get down to work, not get distracted, and hone in on what kind of goals you have. So out of the two subtraits of conscientiousness, industriousness is interesting in the sense that it makes you more likely to succeed in something because you have more self-discipline, but it's actually orderliness that's probably the more interesting of the two subtraits because it has a lot more implications and side effects. For example, it's actually the trait orderliness that predicts certain types of political beliefs, and it's that combination of low openness and high orderliness that makes you more likely to be a conservative, whereas it's the high openness in particular that makes you more likely to be liberal or progressive. Again, when you think about it, this should kind of make sense because being orderly is all about striving for order, liking boundaries and borders because you know what you're getting, as opposed to the high openness liberal or progressive who kind of doesn't like these borders being boxed in and feeling restricted. This can even be seen literally with Donald Trump during his first presidential campaign. He made promises around building a wall or a border around America. But moving away from the political side and back towards orderliness more generally, it kind of sounds like this striving towards order and this dislike of disorder is more about fear. The fear about what could lurk outside of your realm of knowledge, but also your environment. And when you feel like you've got control over your environment, then it can kind of help you alleviate that sense of fear. But it turns out it's not fear that is the main motivator for orderliness, it's actually your sensitivity towards disgust. Now it turns out disgust actually exists in a separate system in the brain when compared to things like fear or anxiety, which is related to neuroticism. And these type of negative emotions serve a very different purpose to disgust. And you can see this because when you feel ill or disgusted, it's not quite the same negative emotions as when you experience fear or anxiety, which often leads you to feel frozen or paralyzed. Why this disgust sensitivity likely evolved is because we can't naturally detect pathogens or contamination, so instead we look at the signs that correlate with these things, such as bad odors, bodily fluids, or even signs of illness and disease in our surrounding tribe. Even unclean surroundings could be a sign of potential pathogens, or at the very least, it increases the chances of some kind of contamination or you getting infected by something. And that's why this striving towards order is a way to mitigate the chances of this happening. So in a way, it's both a striving towards order to combat chaos, but it's also a striving towards purity to combat that sense of disgust. Now it turns out that this feeling of disgust is not necessarily just applying towards physical or literal contaminants or pathogens, but also this kind of sense of purity is often channeled in a political direction too, or in the sense of moral purity, which is also associated with conservatism and similar political beliefs. Now, like I said earlier, when you look at the list of traits associated with conscientiousness, industriousness, and orderliness, it kind of seems like all of these things are good, whereas actually when they get out of hand, they can lead to some psychological conditions such as anorexia and obsessive compulsive disorder. Anorexia nervosa mainly affects upper to middle class women, and they essentially become hypersensitive towards their own bodies. They strive for purity and perfection, and they're driven by the same disgust sensitivity. Unfortunately, it's channeled inwardly, and the main reason why it affects upper middle class women is because they have an environment which is more likely to facilitate orderliness. So this orderliness, if you have it innately, it's more likely to manifest into something that is more extreme, like this particular condition. The other one is obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a mental illness that often fixates around germs and a feeling of disorder in general. There's also a more extreme example, and obviously this is no way reflective of the everyday person who happens to have high orderliness or high conscientiousness, but it can show that this adds one of many motivational factors, and when combined with some other more dangerous ones, it can actually lead to some more drastic outcomes. The example I'm referring to is with Adolf Hitler, and it turns out that he had extremely high orderliness to the point where he used to bathe 4 times a day to alleviate this sense of disgust. Now initially this striving towards orderliness took him in the direction of cleaning out certain factories which were often infested with rats, and he used certain types of gases to basically clean out the factories and kill all of these pests. But as we know from history, this didn't stop there, and he ended up trying to take that kind of sense of moral purity to the extreme, where he felt that a certain type of race called the Aryans were morally pure and everything else was a risk and a threat towards them. Now moving back to a more everyday example of the effects of having high conscientiousness, and this comes down to business success. And when we look at the kinds of people that a business should try to attract or to aim for, it kind of comes down in some ways to one of two categories. And obviously having someone who is intelligent is useful, and this applies to both categories, but it's the high conscientiousness, high IQ person versus the high openness person. And the high conscientiousness category is particularly useful when you're striving towards order and you're trying to get things done, and therefore this type of person is often conducive to managerial success because they know how to plan, they know how to stick to things, and they're very good at getting things done and remaining disciplined. Whereas the high openness person, and we're going to cover openness more in the next video, so definitely subscribe and look out for that one if you're interested, but the high openness person is better at thinking up new ideas, thinking outside the box, and therefore in rapidly changing environments, or one where it's not just a matter of being disciplined and getting something done, then having this ability and flexibility could be particularly useful. That's why having high openness tends to be a better predictor of entrepreneurial success as opposed to business success per se. But also what this really means is in order to have a successful business, you sort of need to have the right ratio of both types of people. You need to have people who are able to think outside the box, be creative and come up with ideas, but also you need people who are diligent and are able to get the job done when that particular task is clearly defined. This speaks about personality more broadly, and using a more simplistic model for personality, which is the color model, and I've made a dedicated video about this also in the past. What it comes down to is having a good balance between different types of personalities is actually the most conducive towards a healthy and successful company, but also a successful and healthy society. That's also because of what I mentioned in the first video in this series about how different personalities, what it comes down to is the ability to see things differently. People see the world and experience the world very differently, and this is based in large part down to your personality. So based on what kind of personality traits you have, it's going to heavily influence the kinds of experiences you have, and therefore this combination of experiences, in a way, if you like to think about it, the diversity of personalities is what allows people to see and fill in for each other's flaws, but also complement their strengths. One of the last things I want to mention is a common misconception around conscientiousness, and that is people who are conscientious are often thought of as being hardworking, whereas people with low conscientiousness are often thought of as being lazy. And while on some superficial level you could say there's an element of truth to this, it's actually more nuanced because the motivations that drive someone to be hardworking don't exist in the same ways for someone with low conscientiousness. So it's not simply that they have lower moral value or they're lazy for the sake of being lazy, it's because the kind of driving forces that make someone end up being hardworking or focused or whatever don't exist within that person with low conscientiousness. This obviously doesn't mean that you don't have any responsibility, or that if you're trying to make the best of what you have, you don't need to push yourself outside your comfort zone. But it does mean I think we should empathize towards people who have different personality traits to our own, because they're ultimately seeing the world very differently, they're experiencing it very differently on an emotional level, and therefore their overall strengths and weaknesses are going to be different to ours. The last thing I want to cover is how much conscientiousness is optimal in general, and the same answer applies to the other traits, which is it heavily depends on your environment. And in the case of conscientiousness, depending on how predictable and stable your environment is, will determine how much you thrive with that trait. So in an environment that is very predictable, very stable, and very controlled, then it allows someone with high conscientiousness in particular to thrive. Whereas in less controlled and less stable environments, someone who is less boxed in by their own ideas, less rigid in their approaches, might end up actually doing better. So like I said, it very much depends on your environment, and therefore the solution is to try and find an environment that best suits your personality. And in the next video, we're going to continue this discussion by talking about the personality trait openness. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video or got something from it. If you did, I'd really appreciate if you could like and subscribe. Definitely feel free to leave any comments down below and I'll read all of those. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.